Rome was devouring herself when Gaius Octavius drew his first breath in the autumn of 63 BC. The republic that had conquered the Mediterranean world now turned its legions inward, generals marching against generals while senators whispered of dictators and kings. Blood had stained the forum stones so often that citizens no longer gasped at bodies left cooling in the morning light. Into this world of crumbling traditions and naked ambition, a child was born who would either save Rome or finish destroying her, though none who witnessed his arrival could have imagined either fate. His father, also named Gaius Octavius, governed Macedonia with the steady competence of a man who had risen through merit rather than ancient lineage. The family claimed descent from the town of Velitrae in the Alban Hills, respectable enough but hardly noble, their ancestors successful in business rather than battle. What elevated this provincial family toward greatness was a marriage. The elder Octavius had wed Atia, niece of the most dangerous man in Rome, Gaius Julius Caesar. The boy would remember little of his father. Before Gaius reached his 5th year, the governor of Macedonia died on the road home to Rome, his body carried back to a family suddenly vulnerable without its patriarch. Atia found herself a widow with young children in a city where widows needed powerful protectors to survive. She remarried quickly, choosing Lucius Marcius Philippus, a consul who could shield her family from the predators who circled any household touched by Caesar's blood. Young Gaius passed into the care of his grandmother, Julia, Caesar's own sister, in whose household he first glimpsed the world that would become his battlefield. Julia's home stood close to the centers of power, her rooms filled with the whispered conversations of senators and the quiet calculations of those who understood that the republic was dying, whatever brave words men spoke in public. The boy listened and learned, his pale eyes missing nothing while his frail body kept him from the rough games other children played. Illness stalked him through these early years like a patient hunter. Fevers came and went, leaving him weakened for weeks at a time. His constitution seemed unsuited to the world he had entered, as though nature itself doubted whether this child possessed the strength to survive what fate had planned. Yet each time the physicians shook their heads and prepared Atia for mourning, young Gaius recovered, his will outlasting the weakness of his flesh. Caesar noticed his great-nephew during visits that grew more frequent as the boy matured. The conqueror of Gaul recognized something in those watchful eyes, not the raw ambition that burned in so many young Romans, but something colder and more patient, a calculating intelligence that weighed every word and gesture. Here was a mind that could match his own, Caesar sensed, wrapped in a body that would never lead cavalry charges or stand in the front ranks of battle. The funeral of Julia in 51 BC thrust young Gaius into public view for the first time. Tradition demanded that a male relative deliver the eulogy, and Caesar, absent on campaign, arranged for his 12-year-old great-nephew to speak the words that would honor his grandmother's memory. The boy who mounted the rostra that day faced a crowd accustomed to the polished rhetoric of seasoned orators, their expectations low for a child barely old enough to wear the toga of manhood. What they witnessed silenced even the cynics who had come to smirk at Caesar's presumption. Young Gaius spoke with a gravity that belied his years, his voice carrying across the forum with surprising strength. He praised Julia's virtues, while subtly reminding every listener of her connection to the Julian line, that ancient family that claimed descent from Venus herself. When he finished, men who had dismissed him as a sickly child began revising their assessments. Caesar received reports of the performance and smiled the smile of a man whose investments were paying returns beyond expectation. The years that followed saw Rome lurch from crisis to crisis, while young Gaius continued his education in the arts that would serve him all his life. He studied rhetoric under the finest teachers Attia's connections could secure, learning not merely to speak, but to persuade, to plant ideas in listeners' minds so skillfully they believed the thoughts their own. Greek philosophy taught him to see beneath the surface of events, to understand the patterns that governed human behavior, while most men saw only chaos. Caesar crossed the Rubicon when Gaius was 13, that forbidden river whose passage transformed a provincial governor into an enemy of the state. Civil war erupted across the Roman world, as legions that had fought side by side against Gallic tribes now faced each other across Italian fields. Pompey fled eastward with the Senate's blessing, drawing Caesar after him in a chase that would end at Pharsalus, where the Republic's last great army died beneath the eagles of the 13th Legion. The young man watched these events with the detachment of a student observing a demonstration. He noted how Caesar combined military brilliance with political cunning, offering clemency to defeated enemies who might have expected execution. He observed how the dictator accumulated powers that no Roman had held since the kings were expelled, yet draped his authority in the forms of republican tradition. Most importantly, he understood that Caesar was building something new from the wreckage of the old, though what that something might become remained unclear even to its architect. At Apollonia, across the Adriatic in the province of Macedonia, Gaius completed his education among the Greek scholars and Roman officers who gathered in that ancient city. He was 17 now, still slight of build, but hardened by years of disciplined study and the deliberate cultivation of his body's limited strengths. With him studied Marcus Agrippa, a young man of humble origins whose military instincts complemented Gaius's political gifts. Their friendship, forged in those scholarly halls, would reshape the world. News travelled slowly across the winter seas, and so it was March before messengers reached Apollonia, with word that shattered every assumption about the future. Caesar had fallen beneath the knives of men he had pardoned, his blood pooling on the Senate floor at the base of Pompey's statue. The Ides of March had claimed the dictator, and with him died the certainties that had governed Roman politics for a generation. Gaius received the news with a stillness that unnerved those who delivered it. Where other young men might have wept or raged, he simply asked questions. Who had struck the blows? Who had fled? Who remained in Rome? What forces could be counted upon? His mind was already calculating possibilities, while others still struggled to comprehend that Caesar was truly dead. Then came the second revelation, more stunning than the first. Caesar's will, opened and read before the Roman people, named Gaius Octavius as his adopted son and principal heir. The sickly boy from Velitrae had become Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, inheritor of the most powerful name in the Roman world and the fortune that supported it. 3/4 of Caesar's vast wealth now belonged to him, along with the loyalty of every soldier who had followed the eagles into Gaul, across the Rubicon, and through a dozen battlefields where the Republic had bled out its final strength. His mother's letters urged caution. Attia begged her son to refuse the adoption, to remain safely anonymous while greater men fought over Caesar's legacy. The conspirators who had murdered the dictator still held power in Rome, their daggers not yet cleaned of the blood they had spilled. To claim Caesar's name was to claim Caesar's enemies, and those enemies had already demonstrated their willingness to kill. Agrippa counseled otherwise. In the camps around Apollonia, veterans of Caesar's campaigns gathered to see this young heir, their weathered faces skeptical but willing to listen. They had followed Caesar through hardships that would have broken lesser armies, and they were not ready to let his legacy pass to men who had murdered him. If young Octavianus would lead, they would follow. but only if he showed himself worthy of the name he now claimed. The decision that followed would echo through centuries. Gaius Octavius, now Octavian, chose to cross the Adriatic and claim his inheritance, knowing that the choice might well lead to his death. He was 18 years old, sickly, inexperienced in war, and facing enemies who commanded legions and controlled the machinery of the Roman state. What he possessed was a name, a fortune he had not yet collected, and an intelligence that had already learned to see further than other men could imagine. The ship that carried him toward Italy carried also the future of Rome, though none aboard could know it yet. The boy who had spoken at his grandmother's funeral, who had studied philosophy while civil wars raged, who had watched and waited while greater men rose and fell, that boy was about to enter the arena, where only the ruthless survived. He would emerge from the struggles ahead as something Rome had never seen, a ruler who wore the mask of tradition while wielding power beyond any king. But all of that lay hidden in a future that would be written in blood before it could be carved in marble. The Italian shore materialized through morning mist as Octavian's ship approached the harbour at Brundisium, that ancient port where travelers had crossed between east and west since before Rome's founding. Soldiers lined the docks, not to arrest him as his mother had feared, but to cheer the name he now carried. These were Caesar's veterans, settled on farmland nearby, and they had come to see whether the heir matched the legend. The young man who stepped onto the stones that April morning walked with deliberate confidence, though his heart surely raced beneath the calm exterior he had learned to project. Mark Antony controlled Rome. Caesar's co-consul and most trusted lieutenant had seized the initiative in the chaos following the assassination, delivering a funeral oration that turned the mob against the conspirators and drove them fleeing from the city. He had taken possession of Caesar's papers and treasury, claiming authority as the dead dictator's political heir, regardless of what any will might say. When word reached him that an 18-year-old boy was landing at Brundisium and calling himself Caesar, Antony laughed with the contempt of a man who had earned his power through decades of war and politics. Octavian understood precisely how Antony would react, and he counted on it. The journey from Brundisium to Rome became a slow procession through towns filled with veterans who remembered Caesar's generosity and wondered whether this adopted son would honor his father's promises. At each stop, Octavian spoke of legacy and obligation, of the sacred duty owed to those who had served Rome's greatest general. The crowds grew larger as he traveled, their enthusiasm building like a wave that would crash against Antony's indifference. Their first meeting set the pattern for years of enmity wrapped in false courtesy. Antony received the young heir in his Rome residence, surrounded by guards whose presence reminded everyone present who held actual power. He addressed his visitor as Octavian rather than Caesar, a calculated insult that denied the adoption's legitimacy. When Octavian requested the funds that Caesar's will had designated for distribution to the Roman people, Antony smiled and explained that the treasury was empty, the money spent on matters of state that a boy could not be expected to understand. The refusal was a miscalculation of historic proportions. Octavian returned to his lodgings and began selling property, his own inheritance, estate Caesar had left him, anything that could be converted to coin. Within weeks, he had gathered enough silver to begin paying the 300 sesterces that Caesar's will had promised to every Roman citizen. Lines formed throughout the city as men came to collect their inheritance from the young heir, while Antony, who controlled Caesar's actual treasury, gave them nothing. With each coin distributed, Octavian purchased loyalty that no amount of Antony's bluster could reclaim. Cicero watched these developments with the calculating eye of a man who had survived decades of Roman politics through knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. The great orator had dreamed of a restored republic since before Caesar crossed the Rubicon, and he saw in the conflict between Antony and Octavian an opportunity to destroy them both. His letters from this period reveal his strategy with uncomfortable clarity. Use the boy against the greater threat, then discard him once he had served his purpose. The young man should be praised, honored, and raised up, Cicero wrote to a friend, the Latin carrying a darker meaning that the words themselves concealed. Praised, raised, and then removed once the Republic no longer needed him. The Senate, or what remained of it, became Cicero's stage for a campaign against Antony that would end in both men's deaths. His Philippics thundered through the chamber, 14 orations that branded Antony a tyrant, a drunkard, and an enemy of the state. Each speech drove the consul further toward open conflict, while positioning Cicero as the voice of republican virtue. Octavian played his assigned role with apparent willingness, accepting senatorial honors and promises of future advancement, while building his own forces from veterans who answered to no authority but Caesar's name. War came in the winter of 43 BC, though not the war anyone had expected. Antony marched north to claim the province of Cisalpine Gaul from Decimus Brutus, one of Caesar's assassins who now governed in the Senate's name. The campaign gave Cicero his opportunity. He convinced the Senate to declare Antony a public enemy and dispatch an army to relieve the siege of Mutina, where Decimus held out against forces that should have overwhelmed him weeks earlier. To command this relief force, the Senate appointed both sitting consuls, Hirtius and Pansa, with Octavian serving in a subordinate role that kept him useful while denying him independent authority. The battles of Forum Gallorum and Mutina shattered Antony's army and drove him fleeing across the Alps with the remnants of his legions. Victory should have belonged to the Senate, to Cicero's restored republic, to the cause of traditional government. Instead, both consuls lay dead on the field, their deaths so convenient that whispers of murder followed Octavian for the rest of his life. Whether he arranged their deaths or merely benefited from fortune's favor, the young heir emerged from the campaign as the only commander left standing, his legions loyal to him alone, his position transformed from useful tool to potential threat. The Senate's response confirmed every suspicion Octavian harbored about aristocratic promises. Rather than granting him the consulship that victorious generals traditionally claimed, they voted honors to Decimus Brutus, one of the men who had stabbed Caesar, and suggested that Octavian might receive recognition appropriate to his youth and inexperience. The insult could not have been more calculated if Cicero had designed it himself, which perhaps he had. The boy who had funded their war from his own pocket, who had led their troops against Antony, who had buried 2 consuls while barely reaching his 19th birthday, was to be patted on the head and sent home to await his elder's pleasure. Octavian's response announced to Rome that a new kind of politician had entered the arena. He refused to pursue Antony further, letting Caesar's murderer Decimus face the remnants of the fleeing army alone. He opened negotiations with the enemy he had just defeated, sending messages across the Alps that spoke of common interests and shared grievances. And when his legions demanded the rewards they had been promised, he did not counsel patience. He marched them south toward Rome itself. 8 legions crossed the Rubicon in August of 43 BC, following the path Caesar had taken 4 years earlier. The Senate, which had congratulated itself on managing the young heir so skillfully, discovered that they had no forces capable of resistance. Cicero's speeches meant nothing against 20,000 veterans who had decided that their commander should be consul, regardless of what tradition or law might say. The city that had defied Hannibal opened its gates without a fight, its senators suddenly eager to grant whatever honors the young man with the legions might desire. Octavian became consul on the 19th of August, 2 months before his 20th birthday, the youngest man ever to hold Rome's highest office. His first acts revealed the cold pragmatism that would characterize his entire career. He formally ratified his adoption, becoming legally what Caesar's will had made him in name. He established courts to try Caesar's assassins, ensuring that every man who had raised a blade on the Ides of March would face condemnation regardless of where they had fled. And he sent messengers north, to where Antony had regrouped his forces, and Marcus Lepidus had joined him with fresh legions from Gaul. The meeting took place on a small island in a river near Bononia. 3 men in a boat deciding the fate of millions who would never know their names were spoken. Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus talked for 2 days, their guards watching from opposite banks while the future of Rome took shape through whispered negotiations. What emerged was the Second Triumvirate, a formal alliance backed by law rather than the informal arrangement Caesar had made with Pompey and Crassus a generation before. These 3 men would rule the Roman world as a committee of dictators, dividing provinces and legions while presenting a united front against the assassins who still commanded armies in the east. But alliances require payment, and the currency these men chose was blood. Each brought to the island a list of enemies, senators, knights, wealthy citizens, whose deaths would serve both vengeance and finance. The proscriptions that followed killed more Romans than the civil wars themselves, their property confiscated to pay the legions that kept the triumvirs in power. Men who had survived decades of political conflict found their names posted in the forum. Their slaves offered rewards for betrayal, their lives forfeit to the needs of the new regime. Cicero's name appeared on Antony's list, and Octavian did not object. The great orator who had planned to use the young heir and discard him discovered too late that the boy had understood the game from the beginning. Cicero fled Rome, but could not escape the hunters who followed. His severed head and hands eventually displayed on the rostra, where he had delivered the speeches that made him immortal. Antony's wife Fulvia reportedly drove a hairpin through the tongue that had spoken the Philippics, a final indignity for the man who had believed himself the cleverest player in a game where cleverness alone was never enough. 2,000 Romans died in the proscriptions, their blood purchasing the uneasy peace that allowed the triumvirs to turn their attention eastward. Brutus and Cassius had gathered an army in Greece, their forces swelled by refugees from the Terror and soldiers who believed they fought for the Republic against tyranny. The confrontation that everyone had known must come was finally approaching, the moment when Caesar's heirs would face Caesar's killers across a battlefield where only one vision of Rome could survive. Octavian prepared for this reckoning with the methodical thoroughness that marked everything he did. He was 20 years old, master of the western provinces, partner in the most powerful alliance Rome had ever seen. Behind him lay a trail of broken promises and betrayed allies, of enemies destroyed and friends discarded when their usefulness ended. Ahead lay Philippi, where the ghosts of the Ides of March waited to learn whether their sacrifice had saved the Republic or merely delayed its transformation into something none of them would have recognized. The boy who had landed at Brundisium, calling himself Caesar, had become a man whose name struck fear into the hearts of Rome's oldest families. He had learned that power came not from birth or tradition, but from legions and gold, from the willingness to do what others hesitated to attempt. The education that began in his grandmother's house was nearly complete. What remained was to prove on the battlefield what he had already demonstrated in the Forum and the Senate, that the heir nobody expected had become the master nobody could control. Philippi's plains stretched beneath autumn skies, as two armies prepared to decide whether Caesar's murder would be avenged or vindicated. Brutus and Cassius had gathered 19 legions in Macedonia, their forces swelled by men who genuinely believed they fought for liberty against tyranny. Across the marshy ground, Antony and Octavian commanded a roughly equal force, though the quality of their alliance remained as uncertain as the weather that threatened to turn the battlefield into a killing ground of mud and blood. Octavian arrived at Philippi already ill, his body betraying him at the moment when strength mattered most. The sickness that had plagued his childhood returned with cruel timing, leaving him confined to his tent while Antony directed the opening movements of the campaign. Critics would later whisper that the young triumvir had feigned illness to avoid danger, though those who saw his condition knew that no actor could counterfeit such obvious suffering. Whatever courage lived in his mind, his flesh had declared its own neutrality. The first battle belonged to confusion and Antony's aggression. His forces stormed the fortifications protecting Cassius's wing, while Brutus's legions simultaneously overran Octavian's camp, nearly capturing the invalid triumvir, who had been carried to safety only moments before the enemy arrived. Cassius, unable to see through the dust that Brutus had actually achieved victory on his front, concluded that all was lost and ordered his freedmen to strike the blow that ended his life. One of Caesar's killers had fallen, though not to any Roman sword. He died of despair born from limited vision. 3 weeks of stalemate followed, while both armies rebuilt their strength and Octavian recovered enough to take the field. The Second Battle of Philippi proved decisive in ways the first had not, Antony's veterans grinding down Brutus's resistance through hours of close combat that left the ground carpeted with Roman dead. Brutus fled the field with a handful of survivors, but flight offered no escape from the fate that had claimed his co-conspirator. He fell on his own sword in the darkness, speaking words that tradition claims invoked virtue while condemning it as an empty name. The last of the liberators had liberated himself from a cause that history had already judged. Victory should have united the triumvirs. Instead, it accelerated their eventual rupture. Antony remained in the east, where the wealth of ancient kingdoms promised rewards beyond anything Italy could offer, and where a certain Egyptian queen waited to entangle him in plans that stretched far beyond Roman politics. Octavian returned westward to face the unglamorous task of settling veterans on Italian land, a process that required seizing property from citizens who had committed no crime, beyond owning farms that soldiers now demanded. The confiscations bred hatred that erupted into open war when Antony's wife Fulvia and his brother Lucius raised rebellion against Octavian in 41 BC. The Perusian War that followed demonstrated the young triumvir's capacity for ruthlessness that exceeded even the prescriptions. When Perusia finally fell after a brutal siege, Octavian ordered the execution of 300 prisoners on the Ides of March, a deliberate echo of Caesar's murder that announced his vengeance had not yet been satisfied. The altar where they died ran red with blood offered to the divine Julius, a sacrifice that horrified even those who had grown accustomed to civil war's casual cruelties. Fulvia's death in Greece removed one obstacle to renewed cooperation between the triumvirs, her passing convenient enough to raise questions that no one dared ask openly. The Treaty of Brundisium in 40 BC reorganized the Roman world, giving Antony the wealthy east, while Octavian consolidated control over the west and the troublesome task of governing Italy itself. To seal the agreement, Antony married Octavian's sister Octavia, a union that bound the two men through ties of family, even as their interests continued to diverge. Yet peace with Antony solved nothing if Romans could not eat. Sextus Pompey, son of Caesar's great rival, had transformed Sicily into a pirate kingdom that strangled the grain supply on which Rome depended. His fleets intercepted the ships that carried wheat from Africa and Egypt, creating shortages that drove prices beyond what common citizens could afford. Hungry mobs blamed Octavian for their suffering, their anger erupting into riots that forced him to flee the Forum under a hail of stones thrown by people who had once cheered his name. The young triumvir who had mastered politics now confronted the limits of political solutions. Navies could not be built through speeches, nor could admirals be created from senators who had never commanded anything larger than a dinner party. Octavian needed a military partner whose abilities complemented his own limitations, someone who could translate resources into victories on battlefields he himself could never dominate. He found that partner in the friend who had accompanied him from Apollonia, Marcus Agrippa, whose genius for warfare was about to reshape Roman history. Agrippa built the fleet that would break Sextus Pompey's stranglehold, constructing an artificial harbour at Lake Avernus, where crews could train without interference from enemy raiders. His innovations in ship design and naval tactics transformed what had been Rome's greatest weakness into a weapon of devastating effectiveness. The man whose humble origins barred him from the highest political honours proved himself the finest military mind of his generation. His loyalty to Octavian matched only by his ability to deliver victories that his friend could never have won alone. The campaign against Sextus nearly ended in disaster when storms destroyed much of the fleet Agrippa had so carefully prepared. Octavian himself barely escaped drowning when his ship went down, the triumvir hauled from the water by soldiers who refused to let Caesar's heir die in a naval skirmish. Lesser men might have abandoned the campaign, but Octavian understood that failure against Sextus meant eventual failure against Antony. The fleet was rebuilt, the crews retrained, and in 36 BC, the Romans returned to Sicilian waters ready for the decisive confrontation. Nolocus witnessed the destruction of Sextus Pompey's power in a single afternoon of slaughter. Agrippa's innovations proved unstoppable, grappling hooks that locked enemy ships in deadly embraces, boarding parties trained to fight as effectively on pitching decks as on solid ground, tactics that exploited every weakness in Sextus's dispositions. When the sun set over waters choked with wreckage and corpses, 300 enemy vessels had been captured or destroyed. Sextus fled eastward to seek Antony's protection, eventually meeting his death at the hands of one of Antony's officers. The grain would flow again, and Rome would remember who had made it possible. Lepidus chose this moment of triumph to make his bid for greater power, demanding Sicily as his province and attempting to suborn Octavian's legions to his cause. The third triumvir had contributed little to the victory and possessed no claim to its spoils, yet he commanded enough troops to make his challenge dangerous if not immediately addressed. Octavian rode into Lepidus's camp virtually alone, trusting that his name still carried more weight than his colleagues' bribes. The gamble succeeded. Soldiers who had sworn oaths to Lepidus stripped him of his military command when Caesar's heir demanded their allegiance. The triumvirate became a doomvirate, and everyone understood that this arrangement too must eventually end. Antony, meanwhile, had surrendered to seductions that would cost him everything he had achieved. Cleopatra of Egypt offered more than her legendary beauty. She commanded the wealth of the Nile and the ancient prestige of the pharaohs, resources that could fuel ambitions stretching far beyond Rome's traditional boundaries. Their alliance produced children and scandal in roughly equal measure, while Antony's Roman wife, Octavia, waited in Athens with a patience that only increased her brother's sympathy and his rival's embarrassment. The donations of Alexandria in 34 BC announced Antony's transformation from Roman general to Eastern potentate. In ceremonies that deliberately echoed the traditions of Hellenistic monarchy, he distributed Roman provinces to Cleopatra and her children as if they were personal possessions rather than territories held in trust for the Senate and people of Rome. Caesarion, the son Cleopatra, claimed Julius Caesar had fathered, received acknowledgement that threatened to undermine Octavian's entire position as Caesar's legal heir. If the boy king of Egypt could claim blood descent from the divine Julius, what was adoption worth? Octavian's response demonstrated the propaganda skills that would prove as decisive as Agrippa's military genius. He obtained Antony's will through means that remained legally questionable. The document had been deposited with the Vestal Virgins, whose sanctuary supposedly protected such papers from political exploitation. Reading the will before the Senate, Octavian revealed that Antony wished to be buried in Alexandria beside Cleopatra, that he had again confirmed Caesarion as Caesar's true son, that he had effectively repudiated Rome for the embrace of a foreign queen. The revelations transformed the coming conflict from civil war between rival Romans into a patriotic struggle against Eastern corruption. War was declared in 32 BC, but carefully against Cleopatra rather than Antony, preserving the fiction that Romans fought a foreign enemy rather than each other. The legal nicety mattered because it allowed Antony's supporters to abandon him without the stigma of treason, while those who remained loyal could be branded as traitors to Rome rather than merely partisans of the losing side. Politics continued by other means, even as fleets gathered and legions marched toward the confrontation everyone knew must come. Octavian extracted an oath of personal loyalty from the western provinces, binding soldiers and civilians alike to his cause through ceremonies that transformed political allegiance into something approaching religious devotion. This oath would serve as the model for future arrangements between emperor and subject, its innovation disguised as tradition and its implications extending far beyond the immediate crisis. The man who swore Italy and the provinces to his service was practicing for a role he had not yet claimed, but had already begun to inhabit. The armies converged on Greece, where Antony had established his forces at Actium on the western coast. Both commanders understood that the battle ahead would settle more than their personal rivalry. It would determine whether Rome would remain centered on Italy or shift eastward toward the ancient civilizations that Antony had come to represent. The world held its breath, while two men who had once divided that world between them prepared to fight for sole possession of what neither could any longer share. Agrippa's blockade slowly strangled Antony's position through the summer of 31 BC, cutting supply lines and intercepting reinforcements, until the Eastern army began to starve within sight of the richest provinces in the known world. Desertions accelerated as officers calculated the odds and chose survival over loyalty. The battle, when it finally came, would be decided as much by the months of preparation as by the fighting itself, a lesson Octavian had learned from Caesar and applied with the patient thoroughness that characterized all his campaigns. The young man who had sailed from Apollonia 13 years earlier now commanded the resources of half the Roman world and the loyalty of the finest general of the age. He had survived assassination attempts, military disasters, and political crises that would have destroyed lesser men. He had betrayed allies and murdered enemies with equal facility, his hands as bloody as any warlord's in Rome's savage history. Yet he had also learned to cloak his ambitions in the language of restoration and tradition, presenting himself as the defender of Roman values against those who would sacrifice them to foreign queens and Eastern corruption. The mask he had crafted during years of civil war was nearly complete. All that remained was the victory that would allow him to wear it openly, and the genius to understand that the mask must never be removed. Dawn broke grey and windless over the Gulf of Ambracia on the 2nd day of September, 31 BC. Inside the narrow strait that connected the Gulf to open water, Antony's fleet rode at anchor, 500 warships that represented the combined naval power of the eastern Mediterranean. Beyond the headlands, Agrippa's squadrons waited in formation, their oars shipped and their crews ready for the battle that months of maneuvering had made inevitable. Somewhere aboard the flagship, Cleopatra watched the preparations with eyes that had witnessed the fall of kingdoms, knowing that today would determine whether Egypt remained independent or became another Roman province. Antony's position had deteriorated through a summer of slow strangulation. Agrippa's genius for naval warfare had proven itself not in dramatic battles, but in the patient work of cutting supply lines and seizing the coastal positions that Antony needed to feed his army. Malaria swept through camps crowded with soldiers who had nowhere to retreat and nothing to do but sicken and die, while their commanders debated strategies that circumstances had already rendered obsolete. The great army that had gathered to challenge Octavian for mastery of the world was melting away through disease, desertion, and the quiet calculations of officers who sensed which way fortune was turning. The decision to fight at sea rather than retreat by land reflected desperation more than strategy. Antony's remaining troops could not march through territory that Agrippa's forces now controlled, while his ships offered at least the possibility of breaking through the blockade and escaping to Egypt, where fresh resources might allow the war to continue. Cleopatra insisted that escape was the goal. Her treasure ships would follow the battle fleet, ready to flee once the fighting created an opening in the enemy line. Whether Antony truly believed he could win the battle or merely hoped to survive it, only he could have said, and he would soon lose the chance to explain. Octavian watched from a position of safety as Agrippa directed the engagement that would determine his fate. The triumvir who had nearly drowned fighting Sextus Pompey harbored no illusions about his own naval abilities. His role was to provide the political authority that justified the war, while his friend provided the military genius that would win it. This division of labor had served them well through years of shared struggle, and neither man saw reason to abandon a partnership that had brought them to the threshold of total victory. The battle began in late morning, as Antony's fleet emerged from the strait in 3 squadrons, their bronze rams gleaming beneath standards that proclaimed loyalty to a cause already lost. Agrippa let them come, his own forces backing water to draw the enemy further from the shore where they might retreat if the engagement went against them. The trap was closing, though Antony's captains may not have recognized the danger until escape had become impossible. Fighting at sea in the ancient world meant fighting at close quarters. Ships locked together while soldiers struggled across decks slippery with blood and seawater. Agrippa's lighter vessels darted between Antony's massive quinqueremes, their rams punching holes below the waterline, while archers swept the enemy decks with volleys that made every exposed position a death trap. The innovations that had destroyed Sextus Pompey's fleet proved equally effective against ships whose crews had never faced such tactics. The moment that decided the battle came in early afternoon, when Cleopatra's squadron suddenly hoisted sail and drove through a gap in the fighting toward the open sea. 60 Egyptian ships fled southward while the battle still raged, their departure stranding the men who continued fighting in their queen's name. Antony saw his lover's purple sails disappearing over the horizon and made the choice that would define his legacy. He abandoned his fleet, transferred to a faster vessel, and raced after Cleopatra while his soldiers died, wondering why their commander had deserted them. The fleet that remained fought on with the courage of men who had no other options, their resistance continuing until flames consumed what Roman rams had not already destroyed. Agrippa's fire ships proved as devastating as his other innovations, Greek fire turning the Gulf into an inferno that consumed vessels and crews with equal indifference. By nightfall, 300 ships had been captured or sunk, their charred timbers and floating corpses bearing witness to the end of Antony's naval power. The army he had left ashore surrendered a week later, their generals accepting terms that preserved their lives while transferring their legions to the victor's service. Octavian did not pursue immediately. The victory required consolidation. Oaths must be administered, garrisons established, the political transformation of the eastern provinces managed with the care such matters demanded. Greece and Asia had supported Antony. They must now be reconciled to new masters through a combination of punishment for the most committed and clemency for those whose submission came quickly enough. The art of ruling required different skills than the art of conquest, and Octavian had spent years preparing for responsibilities that went far beyond military command. Winter passed, while Antony and Cleopatra fortified Alexandria against the assault they knew must come. The couple who had scandalized Rome with their excess now faced the consequences of ambitions that had reached beyond their grasp. Antony's legendary capacity for pleasure turned to equally legendary drinking. His days lost in wine, while his nights brought no rest from the knowledge that everything he had fought for was slipping away. Cleopatra proved more practical, testing poisons on condemned prisoners to determine which offered the quickest and most painless death. The end came quickly once Octavian's forces arrived in Egypt during the summer of 30 BC. Antony's remaining troops melted away like morning frost, their loyalty to their commander overcome by the certainty of his defeat. His cavalry went over to Octavian without a fight. His infantry followed soon after. The last of the great Roman warlords found himself abandoned by everyone, save the servants who attended him and the queen whose love had cost him everything. Antony died by his own hand, though the manner of his death reflected the chaos that had overtaken his final hours. Told falsely that Cleopatra had already killed herself, he fell on his sword with the clumsiness of a man whose warrior skills had deserted him along with his armies. The wound proved mortal, but not immediately fatal, and servants carried the dying general to the mausoleum, where Cleopatra had barricaded herself with her treasures. She had him hauled up through a window rather than open the doors, unwilling to risk capture even to ease her lover's final moments. He died in her arms, speaking words that history has not preserved but imagination has supplied in countless variations. Cleopatra's own death followed 11 days of captivity, during which she negotiated desperately for terms that might preserve her children's inheritance. Octavian received her with courtesy that masked cold calculation. He needed her alive for his triumph in Rome, the Egyptian queen displayed in chains as proof of his victory over Eastern corruption. When she realized that survival meant humiliation, that her children would be raised as Romans and Egypt absorbed into the empire she had hoped to dominate, she chose the death she had prepared so carefully during the winter months. The aspect that legend credits with her death may or may not have been the actual instrument. Ancient sources disagreed about the method, though all agreed on the result. Cleopatra died in her royal attire, surrounded by her faithful attendants, Iras and Charmian, denying Octavian the spectacle he had planned for his triumph. Her body showed no obvious wound, and the snake was never found, leading some to suspect poison rather than venom. The mystery suited the legend, adding one final layer of romance to a story that had captivated the Mediterranean world. Caesarion fled southward toward Ethiopia at his mother's command, hoping to escape the fate that awaited anyone who could challenge Octavian's claim to Caesar's legacy. He did not travel far. Betrayed by his tutors, who convinced him that Octavian intended to make him king, the boy returned to Alexandria and walked into the trap that had been prepared for him. The young triumvir, who had once been advised to eliminate rivals, now faced the last serious threat to his legitimacy, a teenager who carried Julius Caesar's blood in his veins, rather than merely his name on adoption papers. The decision came quickly and was never questioned. Too many Caesars is not a good thing, Octavian reportedly observed, quoting a line from Homer while condemning a boy whose only crime was his parentage. Caesarion died sometime in the weeks following his mother's suicide. The manner of his execution unreported, but the fact of it undisputed. With his death, no living person could claim closer connection to the divine Julius than the adopted son who had fought his way from Apollonia to Alexandria through 13 years of civil war. Egypt became something unprecedented in Roman history, a province that belonged personally to the victor rather than to the Senate and people of Rome. Senators were forbidden to visit without imperial permission. The grain supply that fed the capital placed under the control of an appointed prefect who answered to Octavian alone. The wealth of the Nile, accumulated through 3,000 years of civilization, flowed into treasuries that would fund the transformation of Rome from brick to marble. What the pharaohs had built, Caesar's heir would spend. The treasure Cleopatra had gathered proved even greater than the most optimistic estimates. Gold and silver sufficient to pay every debt Octavian had accumulated during years of civil war, while still leaving reserves that would have satisfied less ambitious rulers for generations. Interest rates in Rome dropped dramatically as Egyptian wealth flooded the markets, the economic impact of conquest demonstrating that victory brought material rewards beyond military glory. The pragmatic Romans, who had questioned the cost of Eastern wars, fell silent before profits that exceeded their calculations. Statues of Antony fell throughout the territories he had governed, his name erased from monuments and his memory condemned by the Senate's decree. Yet Octavian permitted Antony's burial beside Cleopatra, honoring his rival's final wish even while dismantling everything he had built. The gesture reflected not sentiment, but strategy. Excessive vengeance against the dead would alarm the living, while measured clemency toward fallen enemies established the victor's magnanimity. Every action served purposes beyond its immediate effect, each decision calculated to shape perceptions that would outlast the events themselves. Rome awaited Octavian's return with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The civil wars that had devastated a generation were finally over, but what would replace them remained uncertain. The republic that senators invoked in their speeches had been dying since before Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Some would say it had been merely a pretense since Marius and Sulla first turned legions against each other a century before. Whatever came next would bear little resemblance to the government that had conquered the Mediterranean world, though it might wear that government's forms like a mask concealing features too harsh for direct observation. The young man who had seized power through blood and betrayal now faced the greater challenge of keeping what he had won. At 33, Octavian controlled more territory than any Roman before him, his authority extending from the Rhine to the Euphrates, from Britain's mysterious shores to the cataracts of the Nile. Legions that had followed Caesar and fought for Antony now swore loyalty to the last man standing, their obedience purchased by the spoils of Egypt and the promise of peace after decades of slaughter. The question that would determine the future, whether this concentration of power would bring stability or merely new forms of chaos, remained unanswered as the conqueror prepared to return to a capital that had nearly forgotten what peace looked like. The era of warlords and civil wars was ending, though no one yet understood what would replace it. Octavian carried within him a vision of Rome transformed, its chaotic politics channeled into orderly administration, and its violent competition for power replaced by systematic governance under a single guiding hand. The mask he would create for this new role was already taking shape. Not king, not dictator, but something new that would make absolute power appear to be restored tradition. The actor was ready, the stage awaited, and the performance about to begin would last not for years, but for centuries. 3 triumphs processed through Rome's streets in August of 29 BC, each celebrating a different victory: Dalmatia, Actium, Egypt. Though everyone understood that these separate honors commemorated a single achievement. Octavian rode in the gilded chariot that tradition prescribed, his face painted red in imitation of Jupiter's cult statue, while behind him walked prisoners who represented the submission of the East to Roman power. Cleopatra was absent, having cheated her captor of that particular satisfaction, but her children stumbled in chains where their mother should have walked, their humiliation completing the victory their deaths would have made inconvenient. The gates of Janus closed for the first time in 2 centuries. Those ancient bronze doors whose openings signified that Rome was at war and whose closing announced universal peace. No living Roman could remember seeing them shut. The Republic had always been fighting somewhere, its legions expanding frontiers or defending them against enemies real and imagined. Now Octavian declared the wars ended, the peace secured, the future guaranteed by his own vigilance. The symbolism mattered more than the reality, for Rome would continue fighting on its borders throughout his reign. But the civil wars were truly over, and that was enough to justify celebrations that lasted for months. The young conqueror faced a problem that had destroyed every Roman who had attempted to solve it before him. How could one man hold power sufficient to prevent renewed civil war, without provoking the very resistance that had killed Caesar? The dictator's corpse had demonstrated that Roman nobles would not accept obvious monarchy, their daggers ready for anyone who claimed the title of king or wore its trappings too openly. Yet the alternative, restored senatorial government, had produced the chaos of the Republic's final century, competing warlords tearing the state apart, while senators debated procedures and privileges. Octavian's solution emerged gradually through years of careful experimentation, each step tested against senatorial reaction before the next was attempted. He began by resigning the extraordinary powers he had claimed during the civil wars, making a great show of returning authority to the Senate and people while retaining the consulship that gave him legitimate command of Rome's armies. The gesture cost him nothing. He held the consulship through loyal colleagues anyway, but it established a pattern of apparent deference to traditional forms that would characterize his entire reign. The settlement of January 27th BC transformed Roman government while appearing to restore it. In a carefully staged Senate session, Octavian announced his intention to surrender all his provinces to senatorial administration and retire to private life. The senators, coached by allies who understood what response was expected, refused to accept his resignation and instead begged him to continue protecting the state. After appropriate hesitation, he agreed to accept responsibility for those provinces that required military forces: Gaul, Spain, Syria, Egypt, leaving the peaceful interior territories to senatorial governors. The arrangement gave him direct command of nearly every legion in the empire, while preserving the fiction that he served the Republic rather than ruling it. The Senate responded with honors that marked the transformation they pretended had not occurred. They voted him the name Augustus, the revered one, a title with religious overtones that elevated him above ordinary mortals without claiming the kingship Romans despised. They placed laurel wreaths beside his doorway and hung a civic crown above his entrance, symbols traditionally awarded for saving citizens' lives now given permanent form as markers of his unique status. They renamed the month Sextilis in his honor, Augustus following July in the calendar, just as the adopted son had followed the divine Julius in power. Marriage had already provided Augustus with the partner who would share his public and private life for more than 50 years. Livia Drusilla came to him in 38 BC, under circumstances that scandalized traditionalists. She was already married, already pregnant, and Augustus himself had only recently divorced Scribonia on the day she gave birth to his only biological child, Julia. The speed with which Livia's husband granted divorce, and Augustus claimed his new bride, suggested arrangements that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with political calculation. Yet something more than politics kept them together through decades when other connections might have served ambition better. Livia brought to the marriage sons from her previous husband, Tiberius and Drusus, who would play crucial roles in the dynasty Augustus was constructing. She brought also an intelligence that complemented her husband's own, her advice sought on matters that ranged from policy to personnel. Her influence felt throughout the administration, even when it remained invisible in official documents. The partnership between Augustus and Livia would define Roman expectations for imperial marriage, establishing patterns that their successors would follow or disastrously ignore for centuries to come. Scribonia's daughter, Julia, grew up in a household where every action carried political implications and every relationship served dynastic purposes. Augustus personally supervised her education, ensuring that she learned traditional virtues that would make her suitable for the marriages he planned. She would weave and spin like a Roman matron of the old republic, her accomplishments displayed as proof that the imperial family maintained the values they demanded from others. What Julia thought of this careful cultivation, history does not record, though her eventual rebellion suggests that the constraints chafed more than her father ever understood. The years following the settlement brought challenges that tested the new arrangements. Augustus fell gravely ill in 23 BC, his condition deteriorating until those closest to him prepared for succession they had hoped to delay for decades. The crisis revealed how completely the system he had built depended on his personal survival. Without him, no clear heir existed, no mechanism for transfer of power, nothing to prevent the civil wars from resuming as ambitious men competed for the position he alone had learned to occupy. On what many believed to be his deathbed, Augustus made decisions that surprised those who expected him to name a successor from his own bloodline. He handed his signet ring to Agrippa, acknowledging that his oldest friend and most capable general should manage affairs if death claimed him. He gave his private papers to his fellow consul Piso, entrusting state secrets to a man whose republican principles might have made him seem an unlikely choice. The message was clear. Augustus would not found a dynasty in the manner of Eastern kings, would not treat Rome as a possession to be bequeathed to relatives regardless of their qualifications. Yet Augustus did not die. His physician, Antonius Musa, employed treatments that contradicted conventional medicine. Cold baths rather than warm, water rather than wine, and somehow the patient recovered. The illness left its marks on a constitution that had never been robust, but Augustus emerged from the crisis determined to adjust arrangements that had proven inadequate. The consulship he had held continuously since his march on Rome would no longer serve as the primary basis of his authority. Something more permanent was required. The second settlement of 23 BC created the constitutional foundations that would support the empire for centuries. Augustus resigned the consulship, opening that office to ambitious senators whose loyalty could be purchased through access to Rome's highest magistracy. In its place, he accepted tribunician power, the authority of the tribunes who had traditionally protected the common people against aristocratic abuse. This power was held for life rather than a single year, giving Augustus permanent veto over any action of senate or magistrates, while cloaking his authority in the mantle of popular protection. Additional grants completed the transformation. Augustus received Imperium Maius, supreme command that overrode the authority of every provincial governor, allowing him to intervene anywhere in the empire, regardless of the administrative divisions he had established. He could enter Rome without surrendering his military authority, could convene the Senate and introduce legislation, could do virtually anything the old constitution had distributed among dozens of competing officials. The forms of the Republic remained. Consuls were elected. Tribunes protected the people. Senators debated in their ancient chamber. But real power had concentrated in hands that need never release it. Conspiracy followed the settlements as inevitably as thunder follows lightning. Fannius Caepio and Varro Murena plotted assassination, their scheme discovered before it could be executed, their deaths demonstrating that Augustus would protect his position with the same ruthlessness he had displayed during the civil wars. Some whispered that the conspiracy had been exaggerated or even invented, that Augustus had created enemies to justify eliminating men whose loyalty seemed questionable. Whether the plot was real or manufactured mattered less than the lesson it taught. Opposing Augustus brought death, and he possessed the intelligence network to discover opposition before it could act. Building projects transformed Rome from the city of brick that Augustus had inherited into the marble metropolis he had promised to create. Egyptian wealth paid for temples that rivaled anything Greece had produced, forums that expanded the public spaces where citizens conducted business and politics, aqueducts that brought fresh water to a population that had outgrown its ancient infrastructure. The pantheon rose to honor all the gods while subtly celebrating the man who built it. The theatre of Marcellus provided entertainment on a scale the Republic had never imagined. Monuments proclaimed victories and commemorated the dead in stone meant to last forever. Augustus lived simply amid this magnificence, his personal habits carefully crafted to contrast with the excess that had marked Antony's Eastern court. He ate plain food, wore homespun clothing, resided in a house on the Palatine that wealthy senators would have considered beneath their dignity. The austerity was calculated, every choice designed to demonstrate that Rome's first citizen remained a Roman citizen first, his lifestyle a rebuke to anyone who might accuse him of royal pretension. Whether he genuinely preferred simplicity or merely recognized its political value, the performance never wavered through decades of absolute power. Agrippa proved indispensable in transforming Augustus's visions into reality. The general who had won the civil wars now turned his talents to administration, his engineering projects providing Rome with infrastructure that would serve the city for centuries. The Aqua Julia brought water from distant hills. The porticus of the Argonauts displayed art that proclaimed Roman cultural achievement. Harbour improvements facilitated the trade on which the city's prosperity depended. Agrippa worked without complaint, his ambitions satisfied by usefulness rather than titles, his loyalty to Augustus unshaken by rewards that fell short of what his services had earned. Their partnership deepened when Augustus gave Agrippa his daughter Julia in marriage, the union producing children who might inherit the position their grandfather had created. Gaius and Lucius Caesar so named after Augustus, adopted them directly, skipping their father to place them in the line of succession, became the focus of dynastic hopes that the settlement had officially disclaimed. Augustus's republic had no kings and no hereditary succession, yet somehow the emperor's grandsons were being groomed for a throne that theoretically did not exist. The contradictions that would eventually consume the dynasty were already present, visible to anyone willing to look clearly at what Augustus had built. Power that depended entirely on one man's life and abilities could not be transferred like property. Yet Augustus planned precisely such a transfer, while insisting that Rome remained a republic. The Senate, whose authority he had supposedly restored, served at his pleasure, its debates determining nothing he had not already decided. The peace he had established required permanent military force concentrated in his hands, yet he claimed to have ended the emergency that justified such concentration. The mask was beautiful, but it remained a mask. As the decade ended, Augustus stood at the height of his power and the beginning of his greatest challenges. He had survived civil war, illness, and conspiracy to create a system of government that would outlast him by centuries. He had married his daughter to his closest friend, adopted his grandsons as heirs, and established his family at the center of a state that officially had no center. The Republic lived in his speeches and died in his actions, its forms preserved like a body embalmed for display, while the spirit that had animated it passed into new vessels. The man who had been Octavian, who had become Augustus, was learning that winning power was simple compared to the challenges of wielding it wisely across decades. Every decision created enemies. Every favor bred expectations of more favors. Every success raised the bar for future achievements. The illness of 23 BC had reminded him that even emperors die, and the succession he planned remained uncertain despite all his preparations. The mask was secure, but beneath it Augustus aged, his body failing even as his mind continued scheming for a future he could not control from beyond the grave. Peace settled over the Mediterranean world, like a blessing long denied. The legions that had devastated a generation now standing guard on distant frontiers, rather than marching against each other through Italian fields. Farmers planted crops without fear that armies would trample them before harvest. Merchants sailed without dodging warships that might seize their cargoes for one faction or another. Children grew to adulthood without learning that civil war was the natural condition of Roman life. The Pax Romana had begun, and though none could know it would last for 2 centuries, even its earliest years felt like deliverance from a curse. Augustus understood that peace required more than the absence of war. It demanded transformation of the Roman spirit itself. A people who had conquered the world through violence needed new outlets for the energies that conflict had absorbed, new sources of pride that did not require bloodshed. He found his instrument in Gaius Maecenas, a wealthy knight whose refined tastes and political cunning made him the perfect patron for a cultural revolution that would reshape how Romans understood themselves and their place in history. Maecenas gathered poets the way other men collected statues, his patronage supporting artists whose work would define Roman literature for all time. Virgil labored for 11 years on the Aeneid, his epic of Rome's founding transforming the story of a Trojan refugee into a meditation on destiny, duty, and the costs of empire. The poem's hero, Aeneas, abandoned personal happiness to fulfill the mission the gods had assigned him, a portrait that flattered Augustus while acknowledging the sacrifices his rule demanded. When Virgil died with the work unfinished, ordering it burned, Augustus overruled the poet's final wish and preserved the masterpiece for posterity. Horace brought different gifts to Maecenas' circle. his lyric poems celebrating friendship, wine, and the pleasures of a life freed from civil war's anxieties. Yet even his lighter verses carried political messages, praising Augustus's achievements while urging Romans to embrace the moral reforms their leader demanded. The Carmen Saeculare, commissioned for the secular games of 17 BC, proclaimed a new age of virtue and prosperity under divine protection, its performance by choirs of noble children, marking the moment when Augustan ideology achieved its fullest artistic expression. The secular games themselves represented Augustus's genius for transforming political propaganda into religious celebration. Ancient tradition held that such games should occur only once per saeculum, roughly a century, marking the transition from one age to another. Augustus adjusted the calendar to justify holding the games in 17 BC, announcing that the civil wars had ended one era and his rule had inaugurated another. For 3 days and nights, Romans participated in rituals that bound them to their emperor through ties of shared worship, the festivals creating memories that would outlast any political arrangement. Social legislation accompanied cultural transformation as Augustus attempted to reshape Roman behavior through law. The Lex Julia de Maritandis Ordinibus penalized those who remained unmarried or childless, restricting their ability to inherit property and attend public entertainments. The Lex Julia de Adulteriis made adultery a public crime for the first time in Roman history, punishable by exile and confiscation of property. These laws struck at the aristocratic license that Augustus blamed for the Republic's moral decay, though their passage required all his political skill and their enforcement would prove tragically uneven. Military reforms created the professional army that would defend the empire for centuries. Augustus reduced the legions from the bloated forces of the civil wars to 28 permanent units, their soldiers serving 20-year enlistments rather than fighting until their generals no longer needed them. He established the Praetorian Guard as an elite force stationed near Rome itself, their loyalty purchased through higher pay and shorter service, their presence ensuring that no rival could threaten the emperor in his own capital. A military treasury, funded by inheritance taxes, guaranteed that veterans received their promised bonuses, without the confiscations that had bred so much hatred during the triumviral period. The frontiers stabilized along lines that would define the empire for generations. In the north, Augustus's stepsons, Tiberius and Drusus, pushed Roman power to the Danube and beyond, their campaigns subduing tribes that had raided civilized territories for centuries. Drusus drove deep into German forests, his ambitions reaching toward the Elbe, before death claimed him in 9 BC, a fall from his horse, though some whispered of darker causes. Tiberius continued his brother's work, with the methodical competence that characterized everything he did, his victories expanding the empire while earning him the recognition his service deserved. Augustus became Pontifex Maximus in 12 BC upon the death of Lepidus, the former triumvir who had retained the chief priesthood even after losing all political power. The office gave Augustus authority over Roman religion that complemented his secular dominance, completing the concentration of power that made him master of every aspect of Roman public life. He could now regulate the calendar, oversee the Vestal Virgins, and determine which religious practices the state would recognize, powers that previous holders of the office had exercised under senatorial supervision, but that Augustus wielded according to his own judgment. Marcellus had been the first heir to die, his death in 23 BC occurring before the settlements that formalized Augustus's position. The young man had seemed destined for succession. Augustus's nephew, married to Julia, showered with honors that announced his future role. His death from illness during the same epidemic that nearly killed Augustus himself shattered plans that had seemed secure, leaving the emperor without an obvious heir and forcing the adjustments that elevated Agrippa to partnership in power. Agrippa's death in 12 BC removed the partner whose abilities had made Augustus's reign possible. The general who had won every battle his friend needed won, who had built the infrastructure that transformed Rome, who had married Julia and fathered the children Augustus adopted as heirs. That irreplaceable man died on campaign at 51, his body worn out by decades of service that had never received adequate recognition. Augustus delivered the funeral oration personally, his grief genuine, even if politics had complicated their relationship in its final years. Julia's marriage to Tiberius followed Agrippa's death, the emperor's daughter bound to his stepson in a union that served dynasty rather than affection. Tiberius was already married to Vipsania, Agrippa's daughter from an earlier marriage, and their relationship had produced genuine love of the kind that political matches rarely achieved. Augustus commanded the divorce anyway, sacrificing his stepson's happiness to the needs of succession planning that could not accommodate private attachments. Tiberius obeyed, as he always obeyed, but something in him broke that never fully healed. The marriage proved disastrous for everyone involved. Julia had enjoyed her years with Agrippa, who had apparently satisfied needs that Tiberius could not or would not address. She sought satisfaction elsewhere, her affairs multiplying until they became impossible to conceal. Tiberius retreated to Rhodes in 6 BC, claiming he needed rest from public duties, but actually fleeing a situation that humiliated him daily. He remained in self-imposed exile for years, his position deteriorating as Augustus's anger at his departure competed with the emperor's need for his abilities. The exposure of Julia's adultery in 2 BC devastated Augustus in ways that political setbacks never had. His own daughter had violated the moral laws he had imposed on Rome, her lovers, including men from the highest ranks of society, her conduct a public repudiation of everything he had claimed to represent. Augustus condemned her to exile on a barren island, forbidding her wine and male company. His punishment so severe that Romans who had no sympathy for her behavior pleaded for clemency he refused to grant. She would never see Rome again. Her disgrace permanent despite years of appeals from those who found the emperor's harshness excessive. Gaius and Lucius Caesar carried all the hopes that Julia's fall had not destroyed. The adopted grandsons whose advancement Augustus had managed with obsessive care. He supervised their education personally, introduced them to public life at ages that critics considered premature, and sent them to the frontiers where they could earn military reputations under careful supervision. Gaius received command in the east, where Armenian affairs offered opportunity for the kind of diplomatic triumph that would establish his credentials. Lucius was sent westward to Spain, his journey cut short by illness at Massilia. Lucius died in AD 2, his death sudden enough to spark rumors of murder that probably said more about Roman paranoia than about actual events. Gaius followed 18 months later, succumbing to wounds received during a siege in Armenia. Injuries that should not have been fatal, but that festered despite every treatment his physicians attempted. Augustus received the news of each death with the controlled grief of a man who had learned to endure loss, though those closest to him saw how each blow aged him beyond the weight of years alone. Tiberius returned from Rhodes to find himself the only viable heir remaining, his years of exile ended by deaths that had removed every alternative. Augustus adopted him formally in AD 4, though the ceremony included requirements that revealed the emperor's continuing reservations. Tiberius was compelled to adopt his nephew Germanicus, Drusus's son, ensuring that the line of succession would eventually return to Augustus's blood relatives, rather than passing through the Claudian family that Tiberius represented. The adoption was less an embrace than a transaction, necessity rather than affection, dictating terms that satisfied neither party. Posthumus Agrippa, Julia's youngest son, briefly seemed to offer another option. Augustus adopted him alongside Tiberius, apparently hoping to preserve choices that single succession would eliminate. But Posthumus proved unsuitable for the role his grandfather intended, his behavior increasingly erratic, his temperament unsuited for the self-control that power demanded. Within a few years, Augustus had disinherited and exiled him, his disgrace following his mother's to the island prison, where inconvenient relatives disappeared from public memory. The Varian disaster of AD 9 shattered the confidence of Augustus's final years more completely than any personal loss had managed. Publius Quinctilius Varus commanded 3 legions in Germany, his mission to consolidate Roman control over territories that Drusus and Tiberius had seemingly pacified. Arminius, a German chieftain who had served in Roman auxiliary forces and received Roman citizenship, betrayed the trust Varus had placed in him. He led the legions into the Teutoburg forest, where German warriors ambushed the strung-out column across 3 days of slaughter that left nearly 20,000 Roman soldiers dead. News of the disaster reached Augustus in Rome, where he responded with demonstrations of grief that shocked observers accustomed to his careful self-control. He wandered his palace at night, beating his head against the walls while crying out, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." The loss represented more than military setback. It marked the end of expansion into Germany, the failure of plans he had pursued for decades, the proof that even his power had limits that barbarian swords could enforce. He let his beard and hair grow for months, the dishevelment signaling mourning that mere words could not express. The frontier pulled back to the Rhine, ambitions of reaching the Elbe abandoned along with the bones of the soldiers who had died pursuing them. Tiberius returned to Germany to stabilize a situation that lesser commanders might have allowed to deteriorate further, his methodical competence preventing disaster from becoming catastrophe. But the legions lost at Teutoburg were never replaced. Their numbers retired from the army's roster, their eagles lost in German forests, where they would remain for years, until diplomatic pressure or punitive expeditions recovered some of them. Augustus entered his final years, knowing that the empire he had built would pass to an heir he had accepted rather than chosen, that his bloodline's continuation depended on adoptions and marriages he could no longer control, that the German frontier he had hoped to secure remained open to enemies who had demonstrated their capacity to destroy Roman armies. The Pax Romana endured, the provinces prospered, the cultural transformation he had sponsored continued producing masterpieces that would outlast every political arrangement. But the man who had created all this was tired, his body failing, his losses accumulating, the future uncertain despite everything he had sacrificed to secure it.